Funding for this podcast is provided in part by the IPM Network through the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture and by various commodity groups through checkoff dollars, including the United Soybean Board, National Corn Growers Association, and Cotton Incorporated.
The I See Dead Plants podcast shares the stories of people and plants, pests and pathogens, and the conflicts among them. Join us as we speak to the folks who attempt to solve complex problems with plants through pest management research. I See Dead Plants is an extension-based podcast created by the Crop Protection Network and the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center and hosted by Ed Zaworski.
Welcome back to the I See Dead Plants podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ed Zaworski. Today, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about spray drones and pesticide applications in general. I've got Dr. Tom Wolf joining me today from up in Saskatoon, you said?
That's right.
So I'm excited to talk to Tom. I was having a conversation with a coworker that kind of prompted me to be interested in this. We were talking about spray drones. One of my colleagues just got a new drone this year for use in some research projects, and he was telling me some of the practices, and I said, man, I'd love to talk to somebody about that. And he said, you ought to talk to Tom. He said he's listened to you at several webinars or in-person things, and he said you were great. And so we're going to talk to Tom about spray drones today. And as always, folks, I'm going to give a little bit of background on Tom before we get started. He got his bachelor's at the University of Manitoba in plant sciences, as well as his master's. And then he went on to get his PhD at The Ohio State University in agronomy, kind of specifying in spray application technologies. And currently, Tom is, I talked to him a little bit before the recording, and I said, what is your official title? And, we're just going to go with he is the guy at Agrimetrix Research and Training. He said he's the top dog now, so he can call himself whatever he wants. So how's that for an introduction, Tom?
That's awesome. Very true.
So, Tom, I like to get it rolling, just kind of getting to know you a little bit from me and my audience. So I just got a couple questions queued up here, and I just wanted to know, how did you get into plant sciences initially?
I grew up on a farm, and I liked everything about it. I loved farming. I wanted to become a farmer. Actually, that was my goal, but I was also good at other things, and I actually started in engineering. So I went to university with a goal to be in engineering, and it just wasn't my cup of tea. I was always strong in physics and math and all that, but it just ended up being I was a fish out of water. I was out of my element, and I decided to leave engineering. After one short semester, I learned right away this wasn't my cup of tea. So I went into ag. And I decided to fulfill that. And of course, it had to be plant science. There was really no question. We've always been kind of a quasi-mixed farm. I grew up on a dairy farm, actually. We had 20 dairy cows. This was in Germany. So I was born in Germany. And so we certainly had animals, but I wasn't that interested in pursuing the animal side because it was just too labor intensive, to be quite honest. We never got away from it, And we moved to Canada in 1975 when I was just a little boy, and we always had horses. So we were my dad, my sister, myself, my mom even a little bit, are horse lovers, and so we did that. But it was always going to be plants were going to be the main focus. Loved growing crops and driving around the countryside on a Sunday, looking at the crops. That was it. That was the best thing, right? Jumping on the motorcycle, checking the fields. Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. So you didn't want to be a dairyman for life?
No, financially would have been better, but I think I just couldn't. It just was absolutely a no-go. And I always liked equipment. I took welding, and I minored in engineering, and continued to study all those mechanical, technical aspects. Always had a soft spot for the engineering side, the equipment side. We did all, like everyone back in those days, did all our own repairs and welding and this and that. And so that was always super interesting. And of course, spraying, kind of worked its way into that because spraying stimulates you on all those fronts, right?
Yeah. So that was my next question was, how did you get into spray technology? But that's That's perfect. I mean, that makes sense if you're interested in the equipment side. I and we'll get into this a little later. I was talking to Tom about just kind of doing an introduction to spraying, but it's really interesting once you get into the nitty-gritty of it. I don't think, I don't have an agricultural background. I didn't grow up in agriculture and I didn't really learn about it until I started studying plant pathology. And once I saw what was going on there, and like I said, the intricacies of selecting the nozzle, the spray pattern, the boom height, all this stuff, it's really interesting what needs to be done to dial in that practice. It's not just going out there and spray and pray, so to speak.
Yeah, and Ed, it wasn't really my goal in life to become a spray specialist. It was just like, how many careers go. You seize opportunities as they come your way. So I ended up with a master's degree in plant science and agronomy. I consider myself to be an agronomist, and it was about wheat production. I did a master's in semi-dwarf wheat, high input production. And we were looking at rates of N, we were looking at growth regulators and fungicides and trying to see how far can we go, how high can we push this yield, and what's the economics of it. So I ended up doing a minor in ag economics for my master's degree. But that was, and then I was hired, on a contract to be an agronomist, to implement a field program, to be able to grow those crops. But the evaluation was on sprayers, and that's how I got into it. It wasn't by design. It was just like, hey, it's the 80s. Farm economy in the 80s around North America was poor. We had high interest rates. We had low commodity prices. We had little rain in the 80s. And I jumped at the job that I could get. And it happened to be in a spray technology program. And I was just a contractor, but I liked it. I did 3 years of it until the contract ran out, and then went for more education at Ohio State. And that's when I decided that it's going to be a spray specialization. There was a real niche there. And like I said, it's cool because you've got to understand plants. You've got to understand equipment, but you also have to understand weather. You have to understand, even biochemistry, mode of action of herbicides. You've got to understand chemistry, just the tank mixing and all those other chemical aspects. So there's a lot of things going on that can keep you busy, and it's all interrelated, of course, like all things are in agriculture in the plant world, right? So yeah, it's never a boring moment. And I've never thought I was an engineer. I always say to people, I bluff my way through engineering. You learn a few key words and add them to your vocabulary. It makes people think, what you're talking about on the equipment front. But it is basically more of a very strong interest, but not a formal education.
Gotcha. Makes sense. And like I said, you've come highly recommended by a lot of people. So clearly, you at least know a little bit about what you're talking about.
What I try to do is I try to put myself into a farmer's position. That's really what I try to do, and I try to be useful. And so the research orientation that we take is usually from a farmer's service perspective. Of course, we are interested academically in issues and getting to the bottom of things for purely scientific reasons also. But at the end, I do want to say, look, this is what this means on a farm level. This is how you can implement this new technology, or this is how you can change your practices. And the end result is that you will hopefully have a better outcome for growing your crop. But in order to make a recommendation, you have to understand farmers. That's kind of the key thing. When people ask me, what do you do? I say, well, I actually spend most of my time trying to understand farmers, because there's no point trying to communicate if you don't understand the problems and the issues in that sector. And
Yes.
if you're in left field with something, with a recommendation or an assumption, you're found out really quickly, right? And you lose that ability to communicate effectively when that happens. I don't want that to happen. I want farmers to know, I want the industry to know that I do my best to understand where they're coming from and what their struggles are and what their issues are, and try to address them in a practical way.
Yeah, that is key, because if you could have all the information on a pest or a pathogen, but if it doesn't sync up with the farmer's way of doing things and the way of agronomic practices in general. It's kind of meaningless. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
Tom, I think I want to start off with just spray drones in general before we get into kind of the overall uses of them in an agronomic setting or with row crops or however you want to look at it. But just in general, what is a drone?
Well, a drone is also known as a remotely piloted aerial system, RPAS, and that might be a better way of describing it. It does have a pilot, but it's a remote pilot, so it's RC. And it's usually, very often, a spray drone is essentially autonomous, except for some key functions like takeoff and landing. But a drone would be something that you pilot with an RC controller, remote control, and fly it. So they're typically smaller. The typical spray drone now weighs about, I'll talk in kilos. Hopefully that's okay. But the new spray drones, the T100, fully loaded, weighs 170 kilos. So times 2.2 in pounds. And it's pretty heavy these days. But the earlier spray drones were like 25 kilo units. You could easily pick those up, put them in the back of the pickup truck. These new ones take at least two people to do the same things. So they're still small. They're still logistically incredibly versatile because you can't drive them around in a pickup truck. But they're getting bigger, and so that those logistics become more problematic. Labor is always the issue in farming, right? And one of the reasons we have large farm equipment is because it's hard to find good help. And so you end up having bigger and bigger equipment that can be operated by one individual. Increasingly, drones may not be able to be operated by one individual. So some of that logistical thing is falling away.
So, Tom, I mean, I think everybody's probably familiar with a drone as something that my neighbor has, and it's about as big as a laptop, and it has 4 helicopter type blades on it. Are spray drones generally, they look the same? Is there variation in how they're designed for this since they're bigger and heavier?
Yeah, no, good. That's a good point. I mean, we did initially, so the little drones that people have, the DJI Mini or the Mavic or Mavic Pro, are your typical quadcopter. So four props that are alternating in their rotational, so one goes clockwise, the next one goes counterclockwise, and so forth. And then you adjust the position of the drone by changing the rotational velocity of individual motors. So incredibly stable, incredibly quick to change direction, very easy to fly. The latest, largest drone that DJI makes, the T100, is essentially the same, but just bigger. The controller is the same. You can unpack it, and if you can fly a DJI Mini, you can fly a T100. Instantly. It's exactly the same. It's just a little bit louder, heavier, more dangerous, more capable. Now, they do have counter-rotating blades. In other words, they have stacked blades now. So you have one going clockwise and the one below that, but on the same motor or same axis counterclockwise. So that has increased their ability to fly efficiently. Before that, we started to see, hexacopters and octocopters. In other words, more arms and more rotors to try to lift that heavy payload. But the counter-rotating rotary wings, has now proven to be maybe a better way, at least for DJI. So typically we're seeing four of these rotors. Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious as well along the lines. I mean, is everybody using the same types of drones, or are there beginning to emerge, different companies that produce these drones? Or is it kind of right now, is it still new enough that it's all just one player, or what are we seeing out there?
There's been a very important development actually at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2026, which we saw coming in the distance because the U.S. government, was signaling it, and that was that for national security reasons, they have restricted the import of new drones made in China. And so that has affected the largest Chinese player most, which is DJI. They sell the vast majority of drones in the US and Canada. And their new drones will likely no longer be approved for sale in the US. And that
Interesting.
has then given a strong boost, at least in the latter part of 2025, for more US made drones. And we're seeing about a quadrupling from about 6% of the market was US made drones to about 25% of the market in 2025 was US made drones. So that industry is now burgeoning. They still, may use Chinese parts, but there's certain approval processes that they're able to navigate now. So there are about a half dozen major players. DJI, as I said, is the major player, but there's other ones. There's a company called EA Vision. There's XAG. There's Helio. There's something called the Black Betty, and so we're seeing those. There's already companies that have gone defunct. Guardian was an important new drone manufacturer that had a promising technology, and they've run out of funding as of last September, so we won't be seeing that, at least in the short term. But I'm expecting a continued transition to US-made drones. Or at least US assembled drones, at least in some way that they can bypass the FAA restriction on Chinese manufacturing. And that is good for the local sector, but it likely will raise the price of the drones. One of the things about these drones is they're unbelievably affordable. A couple of years ago, a farmer friend of mine called me up and said, "Tom, what do you think of these drones?" And I gave him what our research had shown. And he said to me, "Yeah, I think I'll buy one. And I'm just going to try it out." And, at that time, he bought the T40. At that time, the T40 was, 38,000 Canadian, 35,000 Canadian, something like that. A complete flying package, which is, it's not free, but in terms of a large farm operation, that is an affordable price. And I phoned him up later. "How did it go?" He says, "I bought two," he said. And even the newest drone, I don't have US prices, but even the newest drone, the T100, is coming in at about 50,000 Canadian dollars, roughly.
Gotcha.
That's incredibly affordable for the technology you're getting. And it's also been lucrative for the resellers, to be quite honest, because the drones are relatively inexpensive to manufacture. They cost a fraction of their end selling price. So at every step of the supply chain, from manufacturer to distribution, from distribution to retail, and from retail to end user, everybody can make a decent margin. And so there's been a lot of enthusiasm by the reselling chain for these technologies because, as ag is a tight margin business. It's all about volume. It's highly competitive. There's alternatives for almost everything. There's other dealers just down the street for almost everything. And so you have to be, you're not making a killing selling ag inputs, but drones, you're currently making a good living. And so that has been a big part, I think, of this whole phenomenon. There's been promotion there because it's lucrative.
And I imagine that, like the cell phones in all of our pockets, drones are no different correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm imagining that they're no different in the fact that they're rapidly advancing. There's a new model probably coming out all the time. And you mentioned the resale market. I don't know what like the shelf life of a drone is as far as like how long it lasts, but I imagine that, there's some people trying to get on the cutting edge over and over again as new ones come out, and maybe, I don't know what would increase capacity or battery life or what have you, but
Absolutely. Well, let's go through the evolution. Just,
sure.
the beginning really was the DJI Agris series, and they came out with drones about 10 years ago. And of course, they had been in China for some time. Now, think about this. In China and in many parts of Asia, rice production is, of course, a key agricultural product. And much of it is done with manual labor, planting, weeding, etc., harvesting. Because it's on sloped terrain, difficult access, this and that. And so the use of knapsack sprayers was really prevalent. In fact, the world's best-selling spray nozzle is the hollow cone nozzle made in China, fitted to a knapsack sprayer, because they sell 1 million of these every year, these knapsack sprayers, or used to, and you strap them on your back and you walk through the rice paddy. Well, it's hazardous, it's hard work. There's lots of opportunity for operator exposure. It just simply wasn't the best way to do this. For them, the drone was really, I would say, a godsend. It was a way of doing it remotely, keeping yourself safe, being able to cover more area, and doing it without jeopardizing your health. So that drone idea then basically just came to other non-Asian countries.
Interesting.
But the design stayed more or less the same. Initially, they came out with booms, so there would be a boom mounted at around the, just above the landing carriage, so they wouldn't interfere in landing. But it was fitted with nozzles on a linear boom that was, let's say 10 feet wide, maybe not even that. And so, as with most aircraft, the spray will spread out in the downwash after being released from a boom. Even for a piloted aircraft, a crewed aircraft, if you have, say, a 60-foot wingspan, you might be putting down a 90-foot swath with that, because the boom just spreads out, right? And that's in the sort of an aerodynamic feature of these things. The next iteration that we saw was the removal of the boom and going to atomizers placed directly underneath the rotors. So we had the T10, the T20, the T30, those DJI products, and also the Helio and other products like it that had an array of nozzles under the rotor. And they realized that we don't need a boom because it spreads out anyways. So why not locate it a little bit more efficiently? And that's where we were for a few years until the T40, the DJI T40 came out, I believe, about 3 or 4 years ago. And it introduced what had been pretty common in China already, the rotary atomizer. So rotary atomizers are not new at all. They were basically brought into agriculture by a fellow named Ed Balls from the UK. He formed the Micron company. And there was lots of literature out there about rotary atomization, spinning discs, as they're also known. And there are pros and cons of them, and they are terrific atomizers. What the rotary atomizer does is it allows you better control of droplet size. So you can control droplet size by the rotational spinning velocity of the disc. So the faster you spin, the smaller the drops. The main downside is that they can't handle very high flow rates. So you can flood them. And if you don't want to flood them, then you have to use what's called a rotary cage. A rotary cage is very energy intensive. So aircraft that use rotary atomizers, crewed aircraft, the Air Tractor 502s, etc., they will typically use a rotary cage. It can handle very high flows and atomize very nicely, but the drone can't. So for that is one of the reasons, and of course the payload capability is the other one, that we are really forced into using low water volumes with these devices. But we'll get back to that in a moment. So the rotary atomizers are still located underneath the rotors. They can be 2 or they can be 4. And they can be either, the 4 can be under each of the 4 rotors, or with the new T100, they make an arm where the 3rd and 4th atomizer are actually on the same arm, but just in a different position on that same arm. So there's different ways of doing it, but they're all rotary atomizers now. And that has been a real big change. The swath width is still relatively wide. I mean, we're getting swath widths of, let's say, 30 feet for many of these drones, and that's another issue we have to get back to.
And the swath width is how wide you're spreading the product as it goes down a field?
Yeah. So for those that are new to spraying, I mean, I don't think it's a secret, but I'll just say it anyways, just for simplicity, for completeness sakes. A ground sprayer has a boom. And the boom holds the nozzles, and the width of the swath that a ground sprayer makes is the width of that boom, right? The nozzle sprays straight down, and it basically lands within a couple of feet of where that nozzle was and where it's intended to go, unless there's a lot of drift and the boom's really high. That's another issue. The swath width of a drone or a crewed aircraft is a little bit less certain, because it's not related to the width of the boom as much. It's more related to how you operate the machine. So the swath can go wider or narrower depending on how high you fly, how fast you fly, what your payload is, what the droplet size is. And so that is a very key variable. I sometimes joke with my clients and say, look, if you have a 120-foot boom on your ground sprayer, how wide is your swath? Well, the answer is going to be 120 feet plus or minus a few inches. If you have a T100 drone, how wide is your swath? And the answer is you don't know. You don't know. You actually have to measure that. And so that is an important additional new step that our farming community has never had to undertake. And that is to actually, quote, calibrate that drone by flying it over the crop you're intending and then finding a way to measure how wide that swath was. Because you're going to have to come back you go back up to the field, and then you're going to turn on and come back, and you better not leave a gap, right?
So, Tom, I'm just curious along these lines. My mind is racing with a million questions right now, but
yeah.
First and foremost, I mean, is there any kind of standardization with a spray drone as far as like, I mean, it's not like that with a boom sprayer, I'm sure, but like, I don't know, just if you're trying to standardize that swath width, is there any kind of standardizations about how high you fly it, how fast you fly it? I'm sure there's a ton of other variables that I'm not considering here, but I mean, is there anything like that, or is it kind of just up to the applicator to decide based on the environmental conditions and the crop and what have you? I don't know. Is there anything like that?
It's a key question, Ed. A very, very key question. Right now, let's assume that you are an experienced ground applicator, but you've not flown. You're not a pilot, and you've just bought yourself a drone. And you unpack it, you charge the batteries, and you're flying it. You're probably going to fly it for the first time that same day that you unboxed it. It's quite easy. You fill it with water and you fly it. That's not a problem at all. If you can fly, as I said, a Mini, you can fly a Maxi, whatever,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But the knowledge that you had from ground spraying is kind of not applicable here. So I'm going to give you a list of variables that affect the width of the swath, which is the first thing we should talk about in terms of what the issues are. The width of the swath is a function of flying height. If you fly higher, the swath typically gets wider. If you fly lower, it does get narrow, but it also becomes more uneven. You have to have a minimum height. You can't just lower the boom like you could with a boom sprayer and get, the same deposit. You don't. So it's very sensitive to flying height. The second one is airspeed. And I say airspeed, I don't say ground speed, I say airspeed because it depends on the direction of the wind. So the faster you fly, the wider the swath typically becomes within reason. So the reason I say airspeed is because if you fly into a headwind, you have a high airspeed and the swath gets wider. Then you turn around at the end of that field and you turn around and you come back with the wind. You now have a low airspeed and your swath will narrow. So on the back and forth, you will have two different swath widths. So that's airspeed. Yeah. The third variable is going to be droplet size. Smaller droplets are more likely to be to move with the downwash or some of the other aerodynamic forces at play and go wider. The fourth variable is going to be water volume. When we use less water, we typically also fly faster. We can fly faster. But also just the fact of having less volume typically makes the spray a little bit finer. The swath a little bit wider, I'm sorry. So there's four there. And now let's talk about payload. Let's go back to the T100. The T100 weighs 70 kilos dry and 170 kilos wet. So the payload, the water tank is 100 liters, that's 100 kilos. So when you start flying it, it's going to have a lot of downforce needed to fly, to stay aloft. And as it empties, it's going to reduce that downwash.
Yeah.
So you go up, down. Now it's empty, but the aerodynamic forces that deliver the spray to the target have changed quite a bit, actually. It's possible that the swath width will have changed during that same time. right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's other things at play. Let's now say that you are approaching your headlands, and most of these spray drones are geofenced. In other words, you define the field boundary, and you don't leave it. So in other words, a crewed aircraft will fly beyond the field boundary at full speed, shut off the spray at the edge,
Yeah.
make a turn, come back, turn the spray back on at the edge, and it has headlands that give you a little bit of buffer for the field edge and this whatever might be there. A drone doesn't do that. A drone has to respect the geofence and therefore slows down, shuts off the spray, makes the turn, and speeds back up. So now we have another variable that we have changing downforce, changing tilt of the drone, etc., doing the slow down and speed up phase around the headland, and that can take hundreds of feet to reconcile. So you don't really have the same conditions in the headland area, and that can be a bit messy there. That, in a nutshell, are the variables. Now, as a new operator, you're gonna have to get your head around those. What is the effect? So what typically happens is the very least that they'll do is they'll look at the manual, and DJI does publish and says expected swath width of, let's say, 29 feet or whatever they say in the manual, and a flying height of, say, 10 feet or 15 feet or whatever they say. And that will be your starting. But very likely you will speak to the retailer, and the retailer will have sold possibly dozens or hundreds of these over the course of the last few years, and will have some experience, some feedback, crowdsourced feedback from their applicator, and they may have done their own research, and they'll say, you know what, with this drone, we think this should be your swath width, and this should be your flying height. This should be your flying speed, and this should be your water volume, this should be your droplet size, because we have that experience from the others. And so that'll be your starting point. And then you kind of have to figure out whether that's good for you or not.
Whatever I thought about the variables that go into a spray drone application coming into this conversation, I was not prepared. I did not I couldn't have conceived of all the different variables. I mean, like, especially the volume of water and the changing of rotor speed as the volume of water decreases in order to keep the thing aloft at the same height that it's been. And then on top of that, I mean, you mentioned the downdraft from the propeller blades. This is like it's either like a nightmare for like a normal person, or like not a normal person, a non-engineer. And then it's got to be like, if you're an engineer trying to figure out how to use these things effectively, this is like a never-ending list of variables to play with. I'm assuming, and try to crack the code, but oh my gosh.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And, there's a very good reason why our aerial applicators that fly crewed aircraft, the air tractors, the thrusters of the world, they are professionals and they spent their whole career figuring this out. Not only that, they also have the support of their national the NAAA, that's all we ever call it. What is that? The National Aerial Applicators Association, I think is what it's called, right? They have an annual conference. Hundreds, if not thousands of people descend on this conference, and they learn together how these things work, how to be safer, how to be better, what the new technologies are, how to implement that. Not only do they do that, the NAAA and the CAAA, the Canadian Aerial Applicators Association in Canada, does the same thing. Will meet with federal officials from the FAA in Canada, it's Transport Canada, the EPA in Canada, it's the PMRA, and they will discuss the rules and regs, how to abide by them. Maybe they'll lobby for changes that they think are necessary. They will have insurance. They have required insurance. They will have professional pilots that have possibly come from a commercial pilot background with lots of airtime, and they will have gone to aerial applicator training school, right? So they know what they're doing. Now, the person that buys a regular spray drone doesn't yet necessarily know what they're doing. First of all, they're relying on the word of their neighbors or their dealer for how to run this thing.
Mm-hmm.
There, I mean, online, obviously, there's lots of stuff there, but they're learning by doing,
Yeah.
and there might be some hard lessons. It's entirely possible. Seen some of those for sure. Wrong swath width, maybe drift they didn't expect, maybe efficacy wasn't as what they thought it would be. When do you find those things out, right? You find those things out usually when? 2 weeks after spraying's done?
Yeah. Yeah. Too late. uh,
So those are pretty hard lessons. Yeah.
so is there anything at this point? I mean, you mentioned like aerial applicator training is going on for a traditional aerial applicator. And there's obviously, traditional pesticide applicators trainings for traditional or conventional ways of, boom spraying and whatnot. What is it like in this space of drones right now with regards to training? Is it the Wild West? I know like one of my colleagues, he'll fly a drone for just shooting videos for our integrated pest management team, and he had to get a pilot's license to do so. I'm assuming same goes in this situation, but I don't know. So
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And I can't really speak to the US
sure.
laws as well as I can to the Canadian laws, but I think we have a couple of things in common. One of them is that we have a graduation in the licensing required to just fly a drone, never mind spray from a drone. So the heavier drones will require a higher degree of training by the operator. So we have in Canada, we have a basic license for light drones, 25 kilos and less. And of course, the 250-gram drones are exempt from any licensing. That's why the Mini exists. It weighs 249 grams, so it's just below that threshold. Anyone can fly it anywhere, anytime. The DJI Mavic Pro, you have to have a basic license in Canada, and you have to abide by distance from aerodromes, in other words, airports and that kind of thing. You learn all that when you get your basic license. If you want to fly a heavy drone, you have to have an advanced license in Canada. And in the US, you do as well. And then there's a bunch of caveats. Like, for example, there's exemptions. We have a specific drone course in Canada offered by Transport Canada. You take that course, it's you pass an online exam, you then have a flight evaluation by a certified instructor. They'll ask you to fly a mission, for example. They say, okay, we're in the city here, and I want you to take a picture of this high-rise building, and I want you to take a picture from all sides. I want you to fly around it. Plan the mission for me. What do you do? What's step one? What's step two, et cetera? And then do it. Then do it, and I want to see you fly this drone. And that's a requirement for getting an advanced license, some kind of test like that. So that's that, and you can do that. And most of the retailers offer this for you. They'll navigate the regulations for you, and they'll give you the course material. It might take a day or two to get that. It might take a few tries to pass it even, because some of that can be hard. And it's some kind of abridged version of a pilot's license. It's no picnic. There's all kinds of, knowledge involved here. But we then have a bit of a gap, and that is where the states, and in our case, our provinces take over, and that is the certification for the application of pesticides. So in Western Canada, uniquely, we have 3 prairie provinces where about 50% of the number of farmers are, and about 3/4 of our farmland. Northern Great Plains, we don't currently have a requirement for the certification of pesticide applicators for farm use. So if you want to spray a pesticide with a ground sprayer, go ahead. You don't have to show anything. When you buy the pesticide, you buy it, you spray it. You're a farmer, okay? But if you're commercial, if you're doing it for custom, you have to be certified as a custom applicator, an aerial applicator, and that sort of thing.
I see.
We are currently not sure whether the federal government and the provinces are going to require in Canada that a course be passed by a farmer to fly a spray drone. We don't know that yet. We're still waiting. It's a prerogative, I think, of the provinces, and we'll see. I don't know either about the U.S. situation, but I would expect that there will be some jurisdictions that require certification and registration with the state authority. And then those courses might be multiple day courses, and they'll hopefully talk about all the things that are important. All the water volume, droplet size stuff, drift management, et cetera, et cetera.
Another question that just popped into my head based on what you just said, Tom. Maybe you don't know the answer, but I'm just curious. Like, do we know who is flying these drones? Is it typically the farmer themselves, or is it more often a uh, professional drone pilot applicator, or I don't know. Do you have any handle on what you're seeing in that regard?
Yeah, it's both. Their company started off in the U.S. Rantizo was one of them and they've renamed themselves since then, reinvented themselves. But they would sell a spraying service using drones, and they would charge accordingly. But I think for the most part, what we're seeing is an owner operator farmer situation. That
Got
is
it.
very common. There is a really cool conference that happens annually in the US. It's organized by Dr. Steve Lee of Auburn University. He's the leading expert in drone spraying in the United States. So he organizes an annual, it's actually called the End User Conference. And as you may know, one of the things that I do in my business is I run a website called sprayers101.com, and I do that with Jason DeVoe. Jason is my partner in this. It's actually his brainchild, and he is in Ontario. So that's a 3-day drive from here, is in southwestern Ontario, just in the Niagara Peninsula there. And he went to the end user conference. He's spoken at it several times remotely. And he said he was interested to see that of the 600 or so people that were there, the majority, probably 2/3 or 3/4, were not from an ag background and saw drone spraying as a lucrative business to get into.
Interesting.
So now we have an additional complicating factor. We have people who haven't sprayed yet. They know how to fly a drone, but they haven't sprayed. So they don't know the basics of droplet size, water volume, canopy penetration, the things that's the bread and butter of a fungicide or a herbicide application. And they're doing possibly they're looking to do a custom job. And so there's another level of training required to get those people up to speed. So that could be a potential problem. In Canada, because we've been in a bit of a vacuum for regulations, it's been illegal until very recent. Well, still is illegal to spray a pesticide by drone in Canada. Despite that, we've sold thousands and they're being used. But the regulation is about to change, and we'll see. Well, I said I'm curious to know what the governments will require of us. But there is, I think, a really strong need for training on how to spray with a drone. I don't think it's the same as a ground sprayer.
No. Listen, my background is not in spraying at all. And just having this short conversation that we've had thus far, my takeaway is, man, this is infinitely complicated.
Yeah. And you're constrained by the equipment too. Like, for example, let's take a fungicide example. Ed, in Iowa, if somebody wants to spray tar spot on their corn using a fungicide, what would be your recommendation for water volume? What would you tell them for the fungicide application?
Truthfully, I have no earthly idea. You would not want to ask me.
I would suspect that because the canopy is fairly tall at the time that the treatment is made, so there's lots of biomass, lots of leaf area index, and also physical height, and you want to get through that canopy, that probably a higher water volume is going to be recommended. I don't know what that volume is, but let's say 15 to 20 US gallons per acre is a very likely tar spot fungicide water volume. A drone, by virtue of its smaller size, they've been spraying 2 to 3 US gallons. So just over a tenth of that. And so you have now a challenge. How do you get the coverage that's necessary with so much less water? Remember, most of these fungicides are at best locally systemic. In other words, they flow in the xylem, not the phloem. They don't translocate throughout the plant if they hit the leaf like many herbicides do. So they have to cover the leaf, or they have to cover the target, whatever that target, the biological target might be. And they also have to have a certain coverage. What is that? That's droplets per square inch. You have to have a certain density. If you just put a drop per square inch down, there's lots of room for the disease to thrive in between those drops. So you have to have a droplet density. So how do you do that with 1/10 the water volume of a ground spray? Well, the answer is you do it by making the droplets smaller. You just get more droplets that way. That's the simple answer. So drones, by virtue of that size or that tank size limitation, really have to spray a smaller droplet size to get equivalent coverage. So is that okay? Well, can be. Depends on the weather, right? Small drops drift, small drops evaporate, small drops go places where you don't want them to go. You don't have control over small drops. And so that is one of the challenges that you might have. And it's easy to make the drop smaller, but the repercussions of that change have to be known.
Yes.
And they have to be mitigated in some way. Let's say that you're spraying a fungicide. Most farmers believe fungicides to be relatively innocuous, right? They don't kill plants, they make plants healthy. Well, yes and no.
Right.
There's a lot of crops that have MRLs for fungicides that say this crop should never see a fungicide because it stays in the plant and the MRL's there, and then it's a problem for the export market. There's also a diversification in ag. There's non-mainstream ag crops that don't want to see anything on them, right?
Sure.
Trees, fruit trees, berries, whatever. So drift is that issue that I'm trying to reach. You can't afford to drift onto these crops. You can't afford to drift into water. Fungicides are incredibly toxic to aquatic organisms. People ignore that. They think, it doesn't kill plants. Well, it kills fish. So you do have to be very careful. And managing the drift from a fine spray is very challenging, especially when your flying height is 12 or 15 feet with a large, heavy drone. You're entirely dependent on the downwash for maybe carrying that spray to the canopy, so that has to be perfectly matched. If you fly higher or faster or do something else different, have a side wind, which you probably will have, you are going to have drift. And that has to be treated with incredible respect. And I'm just not seeing that yet.
This concludes part 1 of my interview with Dr. Tom Wolf and our discussion on spray drone technology. Make sure you tune in next week for part 2. Thanks for listening, folks.
I See Dead Plants bridges the gap between plant science research and the impact it has on our daily lives. It is brought to you by the Crop Protection Network and the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center, which are both partially supported by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. For more information on today's topic or other pest management issues, check out our show notes, cropprotectionnetwork.org or ncipmc.org. Remember, this information is for entertainment purposes only. The statements made in this podcast should be interpreted within the limited context of the particular topics being discussed. Contact your state extension program for local information on pest management. For the full non-discrimination statement or for accommodation inquiries, go to cropprotectionnetwork.org/about. Music written and recorded by fellow plant pathologist Sean Toporek. Thank you for listening to I See Dead Plants.